So now in this last video, looking at those derived traits specific to plants, we'll continue our discussion on what makes plants different than their charophyte ancestors. So we'll entitle this next flowchart, Derived Traits of Plants, and this is the last one, and it will be Roman numeral 1, 2, 3. Okay, so a couple more things that plants have that are very specific to just plants. One of them is known as the apical meristems. So plants possess a structure, or structures in many plants would be apical meristems. Let me rewrite that. Apical meristems. These are going to be the roots and shoots of a plant. Okay, we'll get into that specific terminology a little bit later when we talk about more explicit plant structure. But for right now, just understand that apical meristems are where the roots and shoots can elongate. Okay? This is not news to anybody. Most plants know that plants also grow both upwards and technically downwards, right? The roots of a plant start growing more and more and deeper into the ground. This is what's going to happen, and it does happen. So when that happens, this is done for a purpose. The plant utilizes this extension of its roots because the roots are what? Where plants get nutrients from the soil, and everything necessary comes from the soil environment. So in order to maximize your capability of getting things from soil, you have to increase your surface area to volume ratio. We know that that is an incredibly crucial part of anything that's biological. Anything that's living has this overarching theme of wanting to increase its surface area to volume ratio. Think of the hyphae that we covered in fungi. Those fungi want to increase their surface area to volume ratio, so what do? They spread their hyphae all throughout the soil, all throughout the environment that they're within in order to absorb more nutrients, to cover more ground. Plants do the same exact thing, and that's literally what they do. They cover more ground by growing their roots and shoots through this downward process. Okay, now from this, we of course are going to just put that everything I just said into Word. Not only does this increase surface to volume ratio, this increases as a result access to resources, and that's always good for a plant. More resources, more successful growth. Access to resources. And typical resources would be, water, nutrients, anything that's within the soil that's necessary for the plant's growth. But we still haven't explicitly mentioned what the apical meristems are. Now, specifically, the apical meristems, because think about this as we talk about this definition right now. The apical meristems are going to be localized, so very specific, very geographically isolated regions. Localized regions of cell division, CD for cell division, at the tips of those roots and shoots that I mentioned. So the reason why we talked about those roots and shoots was because they're going to elongate, they're going to increase the surface area. They're going to increase the surface area and have the first access and the best access to resources. But that is because those regions need to do tons and tons of localized cell division. And in order to do cell division, you need to be a healthy cell. You need to have a lot of resources. You need to have a lot of food and water and whatever. So in order to do that, you have to make sure your surface area to volume ratio, wherever that is happening, is high. And that's exactly what we established prior. These are localized regions of cell division. Lots of very, very important growth are happening at these tip regions of the apical meristem. Because of that, because this is basically the ground floor of a plant, this is going to be where plants have the specific part that all multicellular life really does well, is where cells differentiate. Cells get specialized. Plants have specialized cells. The reason why is because they all start, as I like to think of apical meristems, as the stem cells of these plants, the stem cell region of the plants. This is where cells differentiate into their various cell types. Okay, so we get cell specialization because of the apical meristem's first access to resources, exclusive, let's say, access to resources, and thus we have cell division here. We have a lot of developmental genes involved here that are going to allow the cells to eventually develop and differentiate into the cells of a normal plant that we would see, like a leaf cell or a stem cell that's going to be growing further and further above the ground. So this is basically the ground floor. The foundation of all plants is their apical meristem. If that is successful, the rest of the plant should be successful. Okay, so that's our other derived characteristic. Another one would be the cuticle. the cuticle. Now, we've mentioned cuticles before, but the context is about the same with this type of cuticle. Here, we're going to have a waxy covering. Okay, so a waxy covering. A lot of times when you pick up a leaf or you look at a leaf, examine it, look at it, you'll feel this waxy covering on the leaf. That's because it's a cuticle layer that's all over the leaf, and it's going to be over all, specifically above ground, because above ground is where we have danger. In the soil, not so much danger, lots of moisture, lots of capability for resources, but here above ground, that's where we need some protection. That's where we have this waxy covering over all above ground parts of the plant. A leaf is an above ground part. Thus, when you look at a leaf and feel it, you'll feel this waxy covering. What's the purpose of this? The purpose is much the same as we established in the arthropods. The arthropods have a cuticle as well, and the mollusca have cuticles as well. It's a conserved characteristic a lot of organisms have. And here, we're going to have the characteristic, and the reasoning behind it is because it prevents desiccation. This is a good word to know if you're studying any sort of animal biology. Desiccation is the drying out. If something dries out, that's when it desiccates. But in order to prevent that, you put a waxy covering around all of it so that it does not dry out, so that you keep all the moisture within it, all the water within it. And plants, of course, need water. Why? Photosynthesis, right? Take a look at that photosynthesis lecture. We definitely established why plants need water. Now, another thing cuticles do, as opposed to, in addition to, I would say, the desiccation, preventing of it, it also protects against microbes. So microbes would be things like prokaryotes that are invasive, that are parasitic, because microbes do not like this cuticle layer. They can't grow here. Mainly because it's so sort of enclosed from everything. It's like putting it into a place without any air or access to air or access to resources, because it's a waxy covering, and it's not an ideal place for microbes to grow at all. Here we also are going to have poor gas exchange, okay? So there is a limitation to these cuticles. It's not the fact that the cuticle is the best thing in the world. There is a sort of a drawback to it, and the fact of the matter is that there's poor gas exchange here. Let me write gas over here. Now, why is gas exchange important? Well, that's because plants need to take in carbon dioxide and give off oxygen through the process of photosynthesis. And so you need a certain amount of gas exchange that works successively. But what's going to happen is the cuticle is going to prevent complete, perfect ability for gas exchange to happen because of the following structure that we'll conclude on. The cuticle also is going to be covering the stomata. Okay, the stomata of plants. Now we know that from our previous lectures, stoma means opening, right? In the plant, stomata are tiny openings. Okay, so they're also found in plants. We're not talking about the mouth here, okay? Don't think of it in terms of development. These are actual structures found in all plants, specifically, let's say a leaf. Look at a leaf, you'll see these. You might be able to see them. Tiny openings on surfaces of leaves and stems, okay? So what are these tiny openings there for? Their purpose is to, of course, open and also close. They open and close. Okay, they have a very specific mechanism for their opening and closing. We may get into it a little bit later when we talk about more about plant anatomy. When we open and close these stomata, we get lots of gas exchange. Okay, so maybe we lose the gas exchange here and there because of the cuticle, but we get lots of gas exchange at the stomatal regions. Lots of gas exchange. And that is great for the plant because the plant wants CO2 and it wants to give off oxygen as its byproduct, and thus we get that capability because we have the ability to take in the atmospheric gases and then take out our byproducts as a plant. Let's say when I say our. Finally, the stomata are also going to be the main route of evaporation for plants. And we'll see this in plant anatomy as well. Plants have this capability of being sometimes vascularized, and they're able to move water from the ground floor all the way, to the tallest trees in the world. Imagine, how do they get their water all the way up to the top and the tops and tips of those trees? Well, that is going to be something that we'll cover a little bit later, but evaporation is going to be a big role in allowing for water to move from one point to another, and that covers our derived traits of plants. 3 very nice traits that are very easy to understand, at least I think so, because they really are applicable to how plants work, and working knowledge of plants really helps us understand these 3 derived traits.